weren't noticing them because they were sort of larger than life. And then the moment came when they went to go purchase some of these items. And they purchased a few of these lower priced items, but then there was that one other thing that cost $20. And they wanted to get it for free. I'm like, I couldn't turn away. For narcissists, admiration and validation are the air that they breathe. Without it, they cannot function. They're lost, and they honestly would feel like they were suffocating. In many ways, social media, when it came along, became the mothership of all narcissists. Because now, for the first time, they could just sit home from the comfort of their home, post edited photographs and bizarre things that they want to say, and just sit back and wait for followers and likes. It changed the admiration-seeking game and the validation-seeking game to a whole new level. It takes us back to our original premise. Narcissists are deeply insecure. And because of that, in some ways it's almost like they don't have a fully formed sense of self. So they count on the world to provide that. It's almost like they're like a sculpture that's not fully made, so they need other people to keep putting the clay on it so it turns into something. So they really do look to the world for that. And in that way, that's part of why narcissists are often so frustrated and so rageful. Because without it, they almost feel edgy, like a junkie waiting for a fix. They need people to tell them, you're great, you're attractive, you're smart, I love you, can't get enough of you, and on and on and on. In the absence of validation, in the absence of admiration, they can often feel quite empty. And emptiness is never a good state for a person to be in. In fact, that's often when people start getting into trouble. That emptiness can often be filled with things like drugs and alcohol, food, spending, sex, lots of things that aren't good for you. And it's often why narcissists often seem to have really unregulated appetites. Feeling empty? Go out and buy a $10,000 bag. Feeling like no one is validating you? Go out and do cocaine. So the two things often tend to go together and can really be a setup for narcissists to get themselves into even more trouble, including addiction. So when we look at this sort of core conflict of the validation and admiration seeking, let's think about what it does to anyone who's with them. So let's just start with sort of an intimate relationship. When we're in an intimate relationship with someone, certainly in the early months and maybe even the early year or two, we do admire and validate them a lot. My God, you're so attractive. I'm so lucky. They'll often say slightly more intense things that should be red flags for you, like, this is the greatest love story ever and no one is ever going to love you like I do. So it's all very big. It's all very admiration seeking. And both of you are telling the other one how wonderful the other one is. You can only keep that up for so long. At some point, things like the dishwasher needing to be emptied and the laundry needing to be done and bills needing to be paid are going to supplant the need to say, you're so great all the time. And you're going to start thinking like, well, aren't we in a rhythm? Like, I think we've established we're great, we're in a committed relationship, but it's never enough for them. And if you don't compliment them the way they want, so think of it this way. I remember someone once saying how she was sharing how she was having a particularly rough week. They had kids and busy life and didn't quite have enough money. And her partner had had some sort of achievement at work. And she did not congratulate him the right way. She's like, oh, that's great. And then she's like, could you hand me that stuff? I need to finish making the salad. And he's like, and he threw the stuff on the ground. What? Do you know how important this is? I can't believe you didn't tell me how great I am. Like, this is such a big deal. You're so ungrateful. And then he kind of went off on his, sort of rant of rage. But basically, she validated him a little, but not enough. Admiration and validation seeking is also why narcissists tend to be prone to having extramarital affairs or to cheating or being unfaithful. Your validation at some point is not going to be enough. That takes us to a topic called narcissistic supply. For narcissists, other people are almost like cargo ships, bringing validation into the harbor. And if you think your validation is going to be enough, absolutely not. In fact, the validation they get from one person over time, it tends to get stale. So they keep having to get it from other sources. Some people will get it from co-workers and friends and family. They constantly need people telling you, you're so great, you're so great, you're so great. But in an intimate partnership over time, they may find that their partner's supply, as it were, it's getting a little dull. So they go and find someone new. And obviously in the first few months of an affair, they're buying them gifts, they're doing this, they're doing that. Then that new person, their new lover, is saying, you're so great, you're so wonderful. Oh my gosh, your wife, your husband are so lucky to have you. Again, they're seeking out validation and admiration. Not necessarily that they want to leave the marriage. They just need some fresh narcissistic supply. And in that way, it is why it is so exhausting to be with narcissists. I often say that it's because of admiration and validation seeking that it's so easy to deal with a narcissist. Because if you can just sort of get your head around it, kind of psych yourself up and saying, okay, I'm going to admire him for about 5 minutes to get what I need and get out of there. I know that sounds manipulative, but it may be the only way to deal with them, especially, for example, in a workplace setting. A narcissistic coworker are the ones that will stop the staff meeting like, hey, everyone want to hear about what I did right, and are very much willing to extol their virtues and talk about how great they are to everyone who will stand still long enough. And so what can happen is if you have a narcissistic boss, it can often be really easy to keep them right where you need them. Compliment them. Oh my gosh, I love your tie. You inspire me so much. You might even want to write them down ahead of time. Like pull them out of your desk drawer. Okay, today I'm going to try the you inspire me, love your tie, and I'm always so happy to work with you. And then mix them up and try another 3 validations the next day. It's a way to kind of get them out of your way. They need it so much. It's like a crying baby. Once you feed them some admiration and validation, you will have appeased them long enough to move them out of your way so you can go do what you need to do. But if this is a close relationship, that's very different. You don't want to think that your marriage or your long-term partnership is going to be really about you saying inane, empty words to a person just to shut them up. But sadly, that might be the only way, if you're stuck in a relationship with a narcissist, to keep that ship afloat. If you had a narcissistic parent, you may have found yourself remembering that, gosh, as a kid, I often did have to tell mom how attractive she was or how great her cooking was or tell dad how great he was. Like, you might even remember childhood dinners where a lot of the time was really praising dad and sort of giving great gratitude to dad for everything he does, but it was very one-sided. It wasn't like everyone was sort of sharing their positive regard for everyone else. That dynamic can persist into adulthood, and it can get really exhausting to be dragging all that narcissistic supply to the front door every time you go to visit your parents. This can happen with friends, this can happen with siblings, but when you feel that all they need is admiration and validation, it can be really, really tiresome. Remember, you can learn a lot of these red flags by watching a person on social media. But people who really appear to be out there, like put more and more edited images, more and more outrageous images, maybe even more and more risque or ridiculous or sort of sort of confrontation-inducing images or words just to get people to engage with them or tell them, you look so pretty, you look so nice. And it can get a little bit much after a while. You're thinking like, how many times does my 35-year-old friend need to post a picture of herself in a bikini or on vacation? I know a lot of people say, no, they're just influencers. I don't know that they're influencers. I do think that they probably are just simply chronic validation seekers, and they're trying to turn it into a job title. So it's very much an exhausting element of the dynamics of narcissism to be with someone who's chronically admiration and validation seeking. The best analogy I could really end up on is if you've ever been scuba diving or watched someone in a movie or something like that scuba diving, you see they have a tank on their back and an air hose that goes to their mouth. They're under the water. It's their only source of air. For a narcissist, if there isn't admiration and validation, it's like someone turns off that, or kinks that hose, or turns off that air supply so they can't have any more. If you were a scuba diver and your air supply got cut off, you would panic. And that's exactly how a narcissist feels when their validation stops. And you'll see it when they're in the middle of a crowd and all the attention isn't on them. It can be a little bit uncomfortable. They may be willing to give up the stage for a little while, but you can start seeing that discomfort sneak in. And if you're in a relationship with a narcissist and it happens to be your big night, don't be surprised if your narcissist halfway through the evening says, you know what, I have a headache. I'm not feeling really well. I might need to go home. I'll catch up with you there. And I'm sure many of you can reflect on times when it was your night and the narcissist in your life, whether it was your partner, a parent, a friend, or a sister, kind of said, I don't think I want to stay any longer, not feeling well. you have a good time. It was simply their inability to tolerate watching you get admiration and validation, which is in fact the air that they breathe. Any one of you watching these videos knows that part of the reason you got so deep into this mess in the narcissistic relationship you were in, whoever it was with, is because you kept giving second chances. And a big part of those second chances were the excuses you made for the narcissist. So part of this requires us to go backwards and think about one big issue. Where does narcissism come from? Any of you who have read my books and watched other videos, we know that narcissism comes from a mix of a little bit of a temperament, like people come into the world, some people are just born a little bit more grumpy and difficult, but that mixes with things that happen in childhood. And we know that people can become narcissistic through a variety of paths. Parents who spoiled them, parents who were emotionally unavailable, parents who neglected them, parents who abused them, having gone through trauma, having grown up in a traumatic situation or setting. All of those things can potentially contribute to the development and manifestation of adulthood narcissism. So if we go back on that, and if you think about, you know what, this person is quite selfish, self-absorbed, unempathic, entitled, superficial, etc., etc., etc. But you're like, he had a really hard childhood. Or like, God, his mom is so awful. That's what I mean by an excuse. Many times a person's history becomes an excuse, a sort of proverbial get out of jail free card on their current behavior. Now, while it might be compassionate to always account for a person's history, to understand how they may respond in a given situation. For example, you may meet someone and they've had a traumatic history in childhood or even in adulthood, and will say, you know what, because this really tough thing happened to me, it's hard for me to make a commitment. So I'm going to be taking this slow, and I hope you understand that. That's a very honest and vulnerable disclosure that somebody can work with. That's very different than a person who chronically invalidates you, verbally abuses you, gaslights you, manipulates you, lies to you, yells at you. And when you finally call them out on that, they'll say, oh God, you got to give me a second chance. You know how it was. I grew up with such a rough dad. No. That's an explanation after the fact, a rationalization of the bad behavior that came first. This is not someone who sat with you and said, hey, you know what? I often have trouble communicating in a relationship because of how I was raised. Please catch me on that because I want to grow. That's not how it happens. When it's used as a rationalization, when their backstory, when their history is conveniently pulled out as an excuse for their bad behavior, this is a great chance for you to gracefully exit in a very compassionate way and say, I'm sorry that happened to them, not my problem. Because that's the key you've got to remember. You're not responsible for their history, and nothing you do can undo that history for them. So many people buy into the fairy tale myth that if I love this person enough, if I'm good enough to them, if I sit here and listen to them the way their parents didn't, then that will clean the slate and all of that bad stuff will go away and they'll fall into the warmth of my love and they'll get it. Kind of not how it goes. If they've already done that growth before they get to you, wonderful. Keep in mind that a toxic, difficult, traumatic early history does not doom a person to not being able to have healthy, loving adult relationships. I have worked with countless individuals who have had very traumatic histories and have gone on to deeply loving adult relationships. But that's because the person who experienced the trauma did the deep dive. They did the work to get to the core of it instead of taking it out on somebody else. So narcissists will often pull their sometimes really difficult histories out and almost weaponize it. Use it as an excuse so that in the midst of a heartfelt debate, when you're sharing your feelings, you're sharing your hurt, they'll pull that out and in many ways It sort of invalidates your experience because now you say, oh, he's playing the early childhood trauma card again. How am I supposed to say anything? Because now you feel guilty. It's a really inappropriate gambit to take in a relationship, and it needs to be a wake-up call. If you keep making excuses for somebody's inappropriate, mean, cruel, harsh, abusive behavior in a relationship, I can promise you one thing and one thing only. Their behavior is not going to change. It is so tempting to make excuses on the basis of a person's history. But a person who's really had a difficult life history will often take ownership of it on the front end and really commit themselves to getting it right and be open to communication from their partner or whoever's close to them about how to get it right. And this isn't just limited to intimate relationships. This could even happen with a parent. Your own parent, you might say to them, listen, you've been invalidating me my entire life. Please stop. And your parent will say, oh, that's all I know. Your grandmother or grandfather abused the heck out of me. The same thing. The fact is, the moment they became a parent, they needed to get their house in order. And they needed to work on their history and not make it your problem. So catch yourself. The best sort of rule of thumb when working with or being with or trying to love or trying to have a relationship with a narcissist is no excuses. As much as excuses may feel like a compassionate path to take, instead what it does is it informs you that this person may not have done the work and the growth they need to have a healthy relationship. Doesn't mean you have to walk away from the relationship, but it is a wake-up call that if you find yourself chronically making excuses for this person, the one thing you can be sure of, this relationship is going to go nowhere fast. Making excuses for narcissists is the reason many times these relationships can last 10, 20, 50, 60 years. Because if you make enough excuses, you construct an entirely new reality. And a reality that's probably not good for you. I remember being a little kid. And I never got away with stuff. I was like sort of a deeply neurotic child. And I'd watch these kids like really get away with stuff. And anytime I tried to sort of get out of my lane or color out of the lines, I always got caught. So I want to tell you guys a story because this is probably an interesting way for me to tell this. Because this is when I saw this, it really gave me pause. You got to remember, I get to travel a lot for work. It can be exhausting, but it gives me exposure to lots of people. And some people collect seashells. I collect narcissism stories. And as you can imagine, I don't talk to people a lot on airplanes because it's just all too much for me. I put on my headphones, I put on an eye mask, and I call it a day. So when I was traveling, there was a man, it was part of a larger group I was with. And we had an opportunity to purchase some things during part of this trip. And they were sold, like, one was $2, you could get, 3 for $5. But then there was this other product they sold, and you couldn't get it as part of the package. You had to buy it separately, I think for like $20 or something like that. I bought my 2 things. I paid the listed price. It felt like a store, like I wasn't going to bargain for it, and I was done. Then there was this guy in the group. Now, he had a lot of money, and he talked to everyone about his money. He had a really nice car, and he had really nice jewelry, and he had a really fancy wife, and the wife had fancy jewelry. And they were like, I don't know, like the millionaire and his wife on Gilligan's Island. Like, they were fancy. And I remember noticing them because they were sort of larger than life. And then the moment came when they went to go purchase some of these items. And they purchased a few of these lower priced items. But then there was that one other thing that cost $20. And they wanted to get it for free. I'm like, I couldn't turn away. The narcissism person in me. I was like, how is this going to go down? So they talked to the clerk and he's like, I come to this place a lot. I like this place. I bought 3 of your things. You need to give me that other thing. That's almost like it contains all of them. It's like you're buying separate things and it gives you, I'm trying to sort of, I'm not giving you full details because I don't want to out the people in the situation. I want the other thing for free, which in essence, the thing he wanted for free was actually worth more than the other things he was buying. He was buying $10 worth of stuff and he wanted a $20 thing for free. And she wasn't having it. She sort of squared off and said, no. And he's like, come on. And he really kept going and going. I mean, he must have spent 10 minutes trying to wear her down. She wouldn't have it. Well, then he moved on to somebody else. And this guy, I think, was probably higher tiered than the person at the counter. And then he wandered with him over to a side part of the shop and said, this is why you need to do this. And then he found a way to have a conversation with this guy about something they both cared about. I think it was a sports team or something. They're ha 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 ha, and they're talking about the sports team. Yeah, you're so clever. You know, these gals at the desk. And he starts demeaning the woman at the desk and telling this guy, the manager kind of guy, you're great. And guess what happened? That manager guy gave him the $20 thing. I was so mad. I'm like, damn it. Another narcissist gets away with it. But here's what happened when I was looking at the store. You might think, well, why don't you go try to get that $20 thing for free? I would have actually liked it. Because I would have been too embarrassed. For me to harass sales staff like that for something that wasn't that important to me, and I'm not sure that I would even do it if it was important to me, was embarrassing. It was uncomfortable. Clearly, those sales staffers were uncomfortable. And ultimately, even though the one guy was laughing with him about the sports store, you could see that all he wanted to do was get rid of the guy. For me, the idea that I would make someone else uncomfortable, keep putting him in the position of having to say no, and keep being insistent in the face of that, it really showed me, interestingly, that the guy, the narcissistic guy, actually didn't care how these other people felt. All that he cared about was getting that $20 thing for free. And this is a guy for whom $20 is like 2 cents to me. It was all about the win. When he got the $20 product, I was within earshot of the group he was with, and he was almost like devalued. He's like, got that for free, and almost tossed it to his wife as though it was worthless. So he literally devalued the thing he fought hard for. It was almost like he love bombed that little $20 thing and had no need for it. In essence, what I saw was, I made me wonder as we drove off in the bus, how did those two staffers feel at that store? I imagine that he was getting towards the end of the day. I think the place was going to close soon. That it probably ruined their day. They probably, God, this was a long day, and I ended the day on this guy who just was such a jerk and gave me a hard time. And ultimately, we just gave him the $20 thing to get rid of him. So let's think about that. They enabled him. And you understand why they enabled him. Because you're thinking, I would want to get rid of him too. The $20 thing probably only cost the store like $2. So it wasn't really a loss for them per se, like in terms of the materials. They just mark it up a lot. So in terms of the accounting of the store, it's not like they were giving away a diamond necklace. So they didn't lose financially. And the two staffers probably said, to heck with it, even if they dock my pay, it was worth it to get rid of this person. But the narcissist, he must have felt like he won. So any of you who are amateur psychologists or psychology students, or not even amateur, would be thinking, what's the best way to get someone to repeat a behavior? Reward it. And there is the issue. Because narcissists often don't care what certain people think of them, particularly sales staff, waiters and waitresses, and people who are in service professions, because they don't care what they really think of them, and they want to get what they can get, what they feel entitled to, they will behave badly in a way the rest of us would be like, ew, no, I'm not doing that. Either I'm not getting the $20 thing, or I'll give them the $20, even if it's not worth $20. That's clearly what it costs in this shop, okay? And so they keep going. They don't care how they affect other people. In some ways, they don't care what their impact is on other people. And then they often get rewarded for that behavior. They get the best seat in the house. They get to jump to the front of the line. They get the thing at a steep discount. And they walk around, and their grandiosity gets filled up. And they're like, look at me. I'm such a deal maker. Look at how well I negotiate. And they really, really believe their hype. And you know what? They're not entirely wrong. They probably wear people down at the negotiation table because they have no sense of embarrassment. Now, do they have shame? I almost wanted to say no shame, but let's face it, narcissists are governed by shame. But for them, what mutes the shame is the win. The win is everything for them. And frankly, if you ran a business and you wanted a salesperson or a deal maker that always closed the deal shamelessly, yeah, you're going to hire a narcissist. So what does that mean for the rest of us? It means that, sadly, especially in areas like sales and negotiation, narcissists often win. Some of you may be watching saying, nah, Doc, I don't agree with you on this one. If they keep acting like that, they're going to get called out. By the time they get called out, they might have made a heck of a lot of money. But where it really matters to me is I'm not in sales. Sometimes I got to buy things. I have to buy a new car soon, and I am dreading the experience. I am dreading the idea of doing that because I can't stand interacting with people like that. So yeah, I'm a sucker. I'm the person who will often pay full price, which I just hope that every car dealer in Southern California didn't hear. But the fact is that because they get rewarded so consistently, that they cash out, they believe their own hype, they are shameless. But when we transfer that behavior to regular life, to close relationships, to parenting, to being a friend or a sibling, it doesn't work. Because for them in an argument, the only thing that matters is to win. They have to win the argument. They have to win the issue. They don't care who they hurt, partner, kid, anyone, as long as they win. That's the self-satisfaction they're seeking to protect that fragile ego. And many times we relent, not that we think they win, but we're just like, enough. Okay, fine, we'll do it your way. That's not a win. That's you capitulating. That's you relenting. And maybe in that some ways you enabling, but I also get it. It's a way of keeping your sanity. But as far as the narcissist is concerned, once again, I got my way because I deserve my way, because I'm me. That's why narcissists so often get their way. Because of a shamelessness, because of their lack of any kind of social awareness, social monitoring, awareness of themselves, awareness of how they affect other people. And that for them, the win is everything. When you can be that single-minded and you get the prize at the end, and you notice that you probably get the prize more often than you deserve, and they don't care about the body count, they don't care about the number of days they ruined for people, they don't care about the number of people they hurt. They just look at the prize, and you know what? The prize is often empty by the time they get it. They're like, I just wanted to win. And it joins the big shelf of trophies, accomplishments, awards, things that they've acquired and no longer care about. Sometimes winning feels good, but it feels best when we do it honestly and we don't hurt other people in the pursuit of it. So when you think about it, that's kind of why they get their way. They're really good at being spoiled kids. All of us need to look inward and ask ourselves, how do we enable the narcissists in our lives? Do we understand why we do it? Do we do it just to avoid the headache? And then really reflect on the fact that this is why a narcissist behavior. The narcissist faces no consequences. Nobody really addresses it. And so as a result, whether through our silence or what we say, we keep enabling them. I'm thinking personally of a situation I had in the last year or so. And I was working with a large group on a project. And there was one person in the group who was deeply, deeply narcissistic, toxic. And nobody else was really seeing it. Everything out of this person's mouth. It was getting to the point where even I consider myself sort of like a narcissistic kind of Jedi person. And even I was like, ooh, Robiny, are you losing your touch? But no, I wasn't. This person was just sort of gross and entitled and arrogant, and everything they said was really mean-spirited. I think that even at one point, they shared a picture of their home, which was much nicer than everybody else's. And he made this mean-spirited comment to somebody in the group who actually lived in a very not nice studio apartment. He's like, hey, you want me to give you a picture of my house? Because it's a lot nicer than yours. And maybe you could put it up on your wall so you could see how nice my house is and how awful yours is. And I was like, did this guy just say this? So now I'm looking around the room and nobody's saying anything. It was a really tricky situation for me to be in because it was a group that largely worked together in an insanely harmonious way and got some really cool stuff done. Okay? And yet I couldn't bear this person. I would go out of my way. It was like musical chairs. I'd always show up to group meals earlier than everyone else so I could stake out a position and then cover everything with like sweaters and stuff, so there's no way I could end up sitting near this person. I would actually get up so I wouldn't need to sit near this person. And when like transportation was being worked out, I was very careful to make sure I wouldn't get next to this person. Like, I put a lot of effort into this. So I was in an interesting position. I didn't call this person out because this group would have actually thought I was being mean. And yet the person's behavior was really problematic, and it was almost like this was a dead weight. So it was a group of 10 people. It was actually only 9 now because this person was utter dead weight that everyone was sort of humoring. So that idea of just humoring someone is enabling them. All I could wonder, because I only needed to see this person for 2 days and then that was that, 2 days, 3 days kind of thing. How was it for the people who actually had to work with this person regularly, who had to listen to their mean-spirited comments and, hey, do you want a picture of my house? And their counterproductive comments and, again, an unkindness that cuts through them. I'm sure many of you can relate to this story, that there's a group where you seem to be the only one or one of the only ones seeing that, like, this is not cool. This is not healthy. This doesn't feel good. And everyone else is like, well, isn't this just kumbaya and we're all getting along? You're like, huh? So this way of the way we enable narcissists is in a couple of ways. Number one is when we say nothing. Now, here's where I kind of feel guilty because I didn't say something to this person because there kind of wasn't a point. Like I said, I was making a tactical decision because I didn't want to be alienated from the rest of that group. So in my fashion, I was enabling them because I wasn't saying this person needs to be out, this person needs to be done. I wasn't participating in it because I would never ever have a conversation with this person. And when he'd speak, I'd often not engage at that point because the things he was saying was counterproductive. But the fact of the matter is when we lie silent in this, for example, a great example would be a family system. When somebody, for example, hijacks the holiday table or all the family functions or the family reunion or the family wedding, that nobody says anything because they often don't want to ruin the holiday or the family get together or the family reunion or the birthday party or the wedding. They don't want to ruin it. They don't want to ruin it for the person whose birthday it is. They don't want to ruin it for the bride or the groom. And we can all get around that. But it is a key example because we often stay silent in the face of it. In our fashion, we do enable it. Another way we do enable it is that we actually go along and tell this person, aren't you great? Now, sometimes we do this because we're trying to appease the narcissist to get them out of our way. But until you know that you're dealing with a narcissist, in some ways that enables it. When we give narcissists promotions in jobs, we enable them. When we give them awards for their work, despite the number of people they've abused, we enable them. When we celebrate them in a family system because they're the one who comes up with all the money, even though they're really verbally abusive, we enable them. And if we want to extend this one line further, this is what the world does. When we put them on the front pages of the papers and we give them big awards and we pay so much attention to their BS, we enable them. When we ensure that they get higher salaries because they're such great deal makers, when we let them go on their crazy tirades in their first-class airplane seats, when we let them make a fuss in a restaurant, and then the hostess gives them the best table because she wants them to shut up, we enable them. And when the world is doing this, it gets really hard for us as individuals. Every one of us does this because the fact of the matter is, most of us, and I agree with this, don't think it's worth the time and effort to take the narcissist on. It often results in a lot of distress for us, a lot of wasted mental energy, and so we let the beat go on. We don't take them on. And in some ways, they interpret our silence as agreement. Now, here's the interesting piece. Narcissists need supply, and narcissists need validation. One thing you can do is cut off the air supply. You don't need to engage. You don't need to give them the compliments. Just remain gray rock. Remain silent. Or remain so uninteresting that they move on. That is one of the techniques, and that's where gray rock is a somewhat powerful technique, I should say. But the fact is, when the whole world colludes to enable them because we're afraid of conflict, because we want everyone to get along, because we don't want the headache, and the fact is because we recognize in some ways we're helpless, hopeless, and powerless in the face of really toxic people, we do have to take a good, hard look at how the world enables us. When we look at some of the current scandals in the world, a lot of the reason they got as far as they did was because we enabled them. These people were told that they were great, and they got the vaunted promotions and titles and awards and accolades, and everyone paid attention to them, and everybody thought they were just the greatest until they didn't. And the people who were victimized by them knew there was no way anyone was going to believe them. That can happen in a company, and that can happen in a family. It's actually a dynamic you'll sometimes see in families that are characterized by abuse. The abuser is enabled because nobody wants to take it on, because they don't want to admit that that's what's happening in their family. And another thing that does drive enabling is denial. To a final point on this, many of you, when you hear the word enable, you might be thinking of the addiction literature, that alcoholics are enabled, drug addicts are enabled. Yeah, and it's from a similar place, right? We facilitate it. We don't call them out. We let them engage in their denial. If the bills are getting paid, if we don't want to deal with them, if we don't want to take it on, if we want to pretend that the family is perfect. But narcissism falls under the same blanket. The only way we can stop this is if we do pay attention. I guess the way I try to deal with it is try to get information out there. But I'm being honest. When I think about how I conducted myself with that person in that difficult person in that work group, I was an enabler in that moment. I didn't want to lose the regard of those other people because I respected them, and I didn't want to take that courageous stance. Other times I have, and I've been proud of myself, but others, I made that call. So like I said, none of us, not me, not you, not any of us are fully immune to this. What we need to do is to pay attention. If down the road I'm asked about this person and said, would you recommend this person for X or Y? I'd say absolutely not. We do have opportunities in our lives to try to stop these cycles. So when we have them, we take them, we be kind to ourselves, but all of us should practice that mindfulness. Be aware of how we do enable narcissists, because our enabling might mean somebody else is getting hurt.
Narcissistic relationships are basically two-way streets of shame. People who are in the relationships feel shame. Narcissism in and of itself is a shame-based pattern. Their percolating sense of inadequacy that's all brewing under consciousness. And when it gets pinged, the shame gets activated. For example, someone might criticize them, or they don't get a promotion or something, and they react with rage. Such fun, right? For the people in the relationship, they feel shame for so many reasons. They are often shamed by the narcissistic person. People around them may shame them for not understanding that relationships are hard or families are complicated. People in these relationships may feel ashamed for choosing the narcissistic person. They may feel ashamed for staying in the relationship. They may feel ashamed by being from such a toxic family or being in such a toxic relationship. They may feel ashamed at how the narcissistic person or people treat them in public, treat them at all. Lots of shame, which can often result in isolation for a person who is in a narcissistic relationship. Now, with all that shame, especially for people who don't yet sort of fully get narcissism or can't easily get out of the relationship, there is a dynamic that is also a double-edged sword. You should know by now, if you have been watching this channel with any regularity, that taking them on, calling them out, or even getting into an argument with them is a pointless endeavor. For folks who are stuck in these relationships, especially if you are engaged in caregiving, co-parenting, or it's your job, you simply can't afford to be fighting all the time. So people, and this may also happen before, again, you fully learned what narcissism is about, people may just do what the narcissistic person asks them to do. It's often easier. It shuts them up. It keeps the trains moving on time. It gets the narcissistic person off your back for a minute. It may also be how you were programmed in childhood to simply comply or go along with what the narcissistic person wanted, and you may not have had much of a choice. Where it gets really interesting, and actually quite gross, is that if you do exactly what they want, they may actually praise you, again, in a gross way. It may be passive-aggressive praise, but it will be praise. Things like, well, good for you. That wasn't so hard, was it? Or they might say, wow, look how good you're doing. Or, wow, good job. See how easy that is? So it's praise, but it's often enrobed in contempt or mockery or dismissiveness. But it's sort of praise, and people learn if you comply, whether it's praise or you just get an easier life out of it, things go smoother. And that's challenging because it explains why so many narcissistic people are enabled in their relationships, because people can't get into it with them 10 times a day. But also people get indoctrinated into these patterns. All of these things often happen quite gradually. You may initially have tried to push back, but over time it's just too exhausting. So then back to that shame. When we get that praise for complying with them, it doesn't feel like ordinary good praise. It feels like I had to devalue myself and keep silent and put up and shut up and do what this narcissistic person wants. And they give me their messed up, patronizing version of praise. So your reason for doing what the narcissistic person wants may not have been because you respect what they're asking you. It may simply be to keep things running and keep life going. And you have and are doing many really praiseworthy things in your life, but the narcissistic person is not going to notice them unless they're at service to them. None of this feels good. And it really kind of creates a gross dynamic in the relationship that brings up that shame. I understand why people in these relationships especially those who decide to stay, or it's more complex, it's a family system or whatever, but they just do what the narcissistic person wants. You end up doing a sort of mental calculation, decide it may not be worth the strife or the stress for others in the household, or people who are around you, or the wasted time, or the psychological bandwidth to fight it. So you do what they want because it's easier. But you're not doing it for them. Frankly, it may be for you more as a workaround. So when that moment, when you do something for this unfortunate reason, it doesn't feel good at all. So having it be praised can bring up a feeling of shame for a person in the relationship. Honestly, there is no easy fix here. If you are going to stay, or some of these relationships have to persist in your life, like family you can't fully cut out, jobs you need to keep, friends who are embedded in a larger friend group that you do like, then this is often the smoothest way forward. I often suggest to people that they take stock of the situation so they are clear on their true north. What is truly motivating them to do this behavior? What is the psychic toll of doing this behavior? Is it something that diminishes you in some way? And are you clear on why you did it? Clarity is everything. You may recognize that you give in to their way of doing something because it'll keep the house quiet on the night before a child in the household has a big assignment due the next day. It's not what you want, but it doesn't feel, degrading or personally invalidating to do it. You don't love that they think you did it their way because you think their way is the right way, but you did it to protect the child, to keep the home serene, to avoid the argument, to avoid interacting with the narcissistic person. So you're clear on why you did it. Not saying you think you're going to change the narcissist or they're going to be happier in the relationship. No, and I'm not saying any of this feels good. But having that clarity can circumvent some of the shame of that episode. The shame of staying in it, well, that's a bigger shame. That's a bigger nut to crack, and that's not what this video is about. Listen, somehow the toxic folks in our lives find a way to even make praise feel bad. Go figure. But I want to this video is really meant to catch yourself in the shame you may feel of like, They're telling me I did a good job. Well, they're telling me I did a good job because I'm doing exactly what they wanted. Yep, that's right. Be clear on that, but also be clear on why you did that. It's not because you think they're going to change. It's not because you think it's going to get better. And hopefully it's not because you don't think you deserve better. But you're making tactical decisions to keep the trains running on time until you can figure out a different mode of transportation. Thanks again.